Okay, so now we're going to solve by factoring. And this is a really cool method of solving these quadratic equations. It's very quick, again, as long as we're looking at something with an x squared. If we have a number in front of that, we're going to talk about a different way to solve that. So one of the first things you have to realize when you're solving a quadratic is that it does need to be equal to 0. So as you can see, this one's already equal to 0. So the next thing we're going to do is just start our factoring process, just like we were doing in the previous videos. So we're going to do our parentheses. We're going to lead off with an x and an x. We're going to need to find two numbers that multiply to a -3, and then they add to a -2. I love working with prime numbers because there's not a whole lot of options. If I look at -3, really the only thing that multiplies to 3 is 1 and 3. Since I need it to add to a -2, that means my larger number, which is 3, will end up being my negative. So I'm going to have x plus 1, x minus 3, still equal to 0. Now remember, it doesn't matter which parentheses you put the plus 1 and the -3, as long as their signs are where they're supposed to go. So now we're going to the solving part. What we're going to do is we're going to take each one of these parentheses. So we're going to take x plus 1, and you're going to set it equal to 0, and you are going to solve that. The only thing you have to do to solve that is subtract 1 from both sides, and x would equal -1. So this would be our answer here. We could do the same thing on this guy here with the x minus 3. Take that. We'd say x minus 3 equals 0. We're going to add 3 to both sides. So x is going to be equal to 3. And we get two distinct answers, guys. That's one of the things you have to realize. When you're doing these quadratic equations, whether we're solving them by factoring like we're doing right now, or we're going to solve them with quadratic formula, which we will learn just in a little bit, we are going to be getting, for the majority of the time, two distinct answers. Okay, so let's look at the second problem here. So again, it's already equal to 0, so we don't have to worry about that part. We're just going to go straight to factoring. We're going to multiply. We're going to lead off with our x. I'm going to go ahead and put my equal to 0 back. And now I need to figure out what my numbers are going to be. So the first thing is I need them to multiply to the number 4. The second thing I need is them to add to the number 5. Everybody's positive, so we're going to have two positive numbers in our parentheses. So multiplies to 4. So we could do 1 and 4. If I add those together, I do indeed get 5. So there is my pair. So in my parentheses, I'm going to put plus 1 and plus 4. So now I'm going to take each one of my parentheses. So I'm going to take x plus 1 and set it equal to 0. So x plus 1 equals 0. Again, solving that, I'm going to subtract 1 from both sides. So x equals -1, so there's one possible answer. Do the same thing for the x plus 4, so I'm going to take this guy. X plus 4 equal to 0. Again, solving for x, I need to subtract that 4 from both sides. So in this case, x is equal to a -4. There's our second answer. Okay, so really when you do this, solving by factoring, if you can factor, after you get it factored out, it should be a really easy process to solve it because you're just going to be either adding or subtracting that number over to the other side of the equation. And I also want to point out, guys, I'm showing every single little step because I want to make sure everybody understands. But there are definitely some places where you can skip a couple steps and still come out with the correct answer. That's just up to you and your preferences on how you work through your problems. All right, so let's look at the third problem here. So on our third problem, it's not equal to 0. So we need to remember, anytime we're solving something with a squared in it, it has to be equal to 0. So this 5 needs to be moved over here to the same side where my 19 is. And I'm specifically talking about the 19 because 5 and 19 are like terms. So since he's a -5, I'm going to add 5 to both sides. And we talked about this in the previous section. So we're using our mathematical opposites. So we have a squared minus 11a And that's going to give us plus, so 19 plus 5 would be 24 equal to 0. Okay, so now we're going to factor. I'm going to lead off with a this time since my variable here is a squared. So I've got an a in both parentheses. So now I need to multiply to a 24. And the second thing I need to do is add to negative 11. And again, if we need to write out here, this sign combination means that both of my signs are negative. Remember, if I have a positive, that means they're the same. And because I'm adding to a negative, that means they're both negative. So I know going in that both my signs are going to be negative. So let's see. Multiplies to 24. So we could do 2 and 12. Again, both signs being negative. If I add those together, that would give me a negative 14. That's actually pretty close to negative 11, so I don't want to go stray too far away from this number 2. So we could do negative 3. 3 will divide into 24 8 times. That would be negative 8. Oh, look at that. Negative 8 and a negative 3 would give us negative 11. So there's our pair that we want in our parentheses. So we're going to do a minus 3, a minus 8, still equal to 0. Again, taking each parentheses, so a minus 3 equal to 0. And we are going to add 3 to both sides. So a is equal to 3. So there's our first answer. Oops, sorry, I need to move that up a little bit, don't I? I'm sorry. So we added our 3 to both sides. A was equal to 3. So now we're going to do the same thing for the 8. So we're going to say a minus 8 is equal to 0. We're going to add 8 to both sides. So we get a is equal to 8. And there's our answer there. Okay, we got one last problem to do for these solving by factoring. So our last problem here, we've got n squared plus 7n plus 15 equal to 5. So again, we've got this 5 sitting over here. We need to move it over to the other side. So we are going to subtract 5. Again, the reason we're doing subtraction is because right here in front of that 5 is a nice little positive number that we can't see. So the opposite of plus is minus. So that's going to give us n squared plus 7n plus 10 equals 0. Again, we're going to do our 2 parentheses. We're going to have our n and our n. So now we need to figure out our pair of numbers here. 1, they need to multiply to 10. Second, they need to add to 7. Again, everybody is positive, so we know that our answers, our 2 numbers are both going to be positive. So we've got 10 here. So I'm going to go with 5 and 2. That indeed is 7. So there's our pair. It's not a whole lot of things that multiply to 10. So sometimes when there are not a lot of options, it makes it really easy to figure out those numbers. So we're going to have x plus 5, x plus 2, still equal to 0. And now we can take each pair. And we can say, okay, n plus 5 is equal to 0. So we're going to subtract 5 from both sides. N is equal to 5. Do the same thing with n plus 2. Bring it over here. N plus 2 is equal to 0. We're going to subtract 2 from both sides. And we get n is equal to negative 2.